Welcome to Quadriga. As we speak, some of the world's most powerful leaders are assembling in Canada for the annual summit of the G7 countries. Even before the meeting began, there were predictions of acrimony. On the agenda is U.S. President Trump's decision to impose punitive tariffs on steel and aluminium imports coming from the EU, Mexico, and Canada. Some observers are predicting a 6-against-1 confrontation with Donald Trump, the odd man out. But divisions in Europe make a united front ever more difficult to achieve. Has Trump's America First transactionalism become the nationalist template for other leaders, including within the EU? Trump goes it alone. Europe at a loss? That's our topic on Quadriga today. And here are our guests. It's a pleasure to welcome Laura Freund. She's a senior fellow at the Berlin-based think tank, SWP. Her research focuses on U.S. economic policy and trade, and she says the EU is currently doing a remarkable job at protecting its interests in very challenging times. And I'm glad to welcome Freund on the show. He is spokesperson of the German section of Republicans overseas. And he says there has been a trade imbalance for years between the U.S. and the EU. The complaints of the Europeans about punitive tariffs are therefore not justified. And finally, we're glad to have Daryl Lindsey with us. He's managing editor of Spiegel International. He says Europe is, for the most part, united against Trump on tariffs for now. But what if this turns into a full-fledged trade war? And let me start out by asking you, Laura Freund, are we likely to see the G7 devolve into a G6+1, as France's finance minister recently said? And if so, what implications does that have for Europe and for the world as a whole?
Well, first of all, it's good that all of those countries and their leaders are still coming together and trying to have a dialogue. It's often forgotten that there are plenty of topics to talk about that are really important besides trade and the economic parts. And I think there's still a pretty good chance also for other countries, even if the US is following a different path on trade and is leading a more protectionist policy approach right now, there's still a chance that all of those other countries that are united in the G7, in the G20, and also all of the member states of the WTO will be able to carry on and just stick to the global liberal international order.
Do you really think they're going to get to any other topics at this summit besides trade?
I surely hope they will, because there are really big crises, like the one in Syria, in eastern Ukraine, other topics that are really relevant that we should be talking about. Topics like equal rights for women and men and so on. If you have a look at the agenda for the G7, also climate change. These are really the topics that we should be talking about, rather than always getting into those fights. Right?
The U.S., Freund, is giving as its official justification for imposing these punitive tariffs not unfair trading practices, actually, but national security. By proceeding under what is a fairly obscure national law rather than under standard WTO procedures, isn't the U.S. ultimately thumbing its nose at its allies and perhaps at that rule-based international order in general?
Sure, a bit. I mean, certainly Trump needed to react fastly, so he needed a reason in order to act like this. I believe, actually, the reason is a bit different. We don't have an equivalent in the tariffs, and that has to be solved. For many, many years, we claimed this. You know, the U.S. claimed this many years, like other administration, Obama, but also Clinton, George Bush Jr., for instance. They claimed this many, many times, and nothing has happened. And the WTO acts quite slowly and takes years and years. I mean, you're not just talking about bananas with Guatemala. It took many years for a very minor thing. So I believe we need some action now. We have a open discussion as we sit here, for instance, and I think that's very healthy. And we need, and President Trump only has taken 1.5% of overall trade. Okay, so he could have, we could have talked about other goods like cars, automotive, and like that. He didn't. So he started up with something with a minor thing, I believe, and now the Europeans have to be unified, and they have to have to speak with one voice. And I think these talks will proceed, and I think we'll get to a very positive end finally.
Okay, I want to come back to a couple of those points that you made in just a moment. But first, looking at the big picture, Daryl, Lindsey, it was shortly after the last G7 summit that took place in Italy that Donald Trump announced that he was that the U.S. would be leaving the Paris climate agreement. Many Europeans see that, together with these tariffs, together with the U.S. retreat from the Iran treaty that it had signed up to, as the U.S. essentially turning its back on the entire international order that was established after the Second World War. Do you see a risk of that? And if so, what do you see as the implications?
I see, taken together, there's a very real risk of that happening. The question that a lot of people are asking now, is it America first or is it America only? All of these moves represent a move away from the multilateral system that the United States actually built in the post-war era out of its own interests. And it does definitely feel like there's a risk of moving away from that. I mean, the real danger is if this grows into a tit for tat, if Europe responds in July as it plans to do currently, and then if it goes beyond that, if Trump follows through with the punitive tariffs on automobiles, which is currently being explored by the government, then things get very serious, because then you'll see a slow divide, a wedge going through Europe, because obviously the Germans have a very different perspective because automobiles are the sort of the engine of the economy, whereas France has a different take. They'd like to be very firm with Trump, but France doesn't even really sell automobiles in the United States. They've been absent from the market for decades.
Whether, in fact, this spreads onto the automobile sector is very much a question of the potential for an escalating trade war that you talked about in your opening statement. Let's first take a look at the reaction to the U.S. announcement that the steel and aluminum tariffs would now be applied to some of the U.S. closest trading partners and friends.
President Trump seems to get along with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau almost as well as he does with French President Emmanuel Macron. But neither Trudeau nor Macron managed to talk the president out of imposing the tariffs. Donald Trump has launched an assault on international trade, and those affected are pretty upset.
The fact that the president has moved forward with these tariffs is not just going to hurt Canadian jobs, it's going to hurt U.S. jobs as well.
I believe it's important for the EU to make a rapid and appropriate response within the framework of the WTO.
We believe these tariffs are not consistent with WTO regulations.
This is a bad day for the world trade.
Trump's tariffs. Is this how America treats its friends?
So as we all know, Donald Trump is a bargainer, a deal maker. And in that context, Laura Daniels, are the Europeans perhaps taking these tariffs too seriously? Is this actually just Trump's opening bid in a poker game?
It might be, but I would say that especially the European Commission that's responsible for trade policy in the EU is taking a very rational and proportionate approach right now. And it's obvious, and they have declared this early on, that there need to be some countermeasures, but they're proportionate. And now, of course, everyone is waiting on what will be the next step on the US side, but we also have to consider that there's significant amount of opposition to further tariffs on cars, autos, auto parts and so on within the US. And it would also be much more hurtful if Trump actually took that action.
I want to talk about that in just a moment, but just to drill a little bit deeper on what we heard from Ralph Freund a moment ago. It's an argument that has been made by the Trump administration that there are great disparities if you look at overall EU customs duties on American imports compared to overall American duties on imports from the EU. Now, I did check the numbers last night, the official WTO numbers. It says that on average, the difference is about 1.7%. Not all that large, it would seem. What's your assessment on that? You are a trade expert.
Well, it's a typical rhetorical trick, I would say, on the side of Donald Trump and also his advisors, to just take one piece out of the whole picture and then blow it up. So obviously, I mean, there are rules
which is especially the automobile piece, as I understand it.
Right.
There is a real disparity.
And not even all kinds of automobiles, because if you take pickups, there's much higher tariffs on pickups in the US imported from the EU than on anything else and anywhere else in the world. So it always depends on what parts of the whole picture you look at. And also, I mean, generally, it makes very little sense to look at the trade balances. And this has often been said in this whole debate on tariffs. It makes no sense to just look at trades and goods and not consider the significant trade surplus in services that the U.S. has vis-à-vis the European Union.
What's your response to that, Ralph Freund? Because I know that in your day job, besides working with Republicans overseas, you are involved in the financial sector. That means you are involved in cross-border financial flows. Are you not concerned that the risks of this action could be a lot greater than the potential gains? If we're talking about only an overall difference of 1.7%, is it really worth risking a trade war?
First of all, no, it's not. I mean, I don't see a trade war, first of all. Second of all, I just want to add something to the figure 1.7. It depends if you really weigh the trade. Could be, I have figures up to 2.5%, but let's put it in between 1.7 and 2%. Talking about 6% in one direction and 4% in the other is still about a third difference, which is quite a lot, referring to the volume of trade, first of all. And I think there are some disparities.
I was referring to duties, to actual tariffs as they stand on a broad range of products in the EU and in the US.
And it was at one point negotiated. Absolutely correct. But at some point, trade developed differently. Some goods are like not exported anymore. Some even more get exported even more. So there's an imbalance, and this imbalance, I believe, needs to be fixed. So I think it was a very mild shot from the Trump administration to go on those tariffs, and I think I think we should now go into talks. There was just like as you mentioned it, a bit in a poker game. I believe in the end we should go back to TTIP and go back to those.
That's the transatlantic trade agreement that, in fact, the U.S. Also walked away from.
Absolutely, but maybe that's a new opportunity for the new talks. Maybe we should take out the investment part, because that was like the Europeans are very critical on that part, and we should only talk about trade. But that would be a good start for a new negotiation.
We just heard Ralph Freund saying he doesn't think this could escalate into a full-fledged trade war. You did mention that possibility in your opening statement. We have seen both the EU, Canada, and Mexico now announcing what are called counterbalancing measures. That means additional targeted tariffs within the WTO system, but that definitely would take this to another level.
It's still largely political symbolism. These products that have been chosen by Cecilia Malmström are directed at products.
She's the trade commissioner for the EU?
For the EU from Sweden. And she's selected products that are symbolic because they come from areas where Trump was elected. And so the idea is to directly hit that. I mean, it's not... I expressed my fears earlier. I do see a wedge being driven between Europe, and I think if it gets more serious, a trade war could see a division between France and Germany. But it's not in Europe's interest to have a trade war with the United States. It's our closest trading partner here, our very closest trading partner, and we need to come to some sort of compromise. And I think if you talk to any sensible German politician, they also know that something has to be done with the tariffs on the imports and exports here. And so we need to find a middle ground on this. And I'm optimistic that that will happen. I just fear that with all of these other unilateral factors and the sort of, bully, schoolyard bully on the playground factor that Trump represents, that it's going to create a lot of tensions. And tensions are, as Macron said, you're not going to negotiate when the gun is at your head.
Ralph Freund, Donald Trump tweeted some months ago, as the tariffs were first announced, that trade wars are easy to win. Do you really think that the U.S. can emerge economically unscathed from a further escalation of this? And particularly, won't there at the very least be political fallout if, in fact, Europeans stop buying, for example, soybeans from farmers in the Midwest?
Well, certainly not. Nobody's interested in a trade war. But still, the U.S. has, in the short run, more to gain than to lose, because the Europeans are exporting more into the U.S. than vice versa. So in the beginning...
But U.S.-based manufacturers use steel and aluminium that are imported.
Yes.
That means U.S. may see less or more expensive exports, which hurts sales.
1.5% of overall trade. So in the beginning, I believe, is more symbolic. I believe in the long run, it will also hurt the U.S. economy. But right in the beginning, because Europe is just more dependent on the North American market, which is the largest market in the world, the interest is more on the European side than in the U.S. side. And I think Trump is playing that card, but he's not going to pull it at one point.
Laura Daniels, weigh in on this, if you would, please. And I asked earlier about the prospects for the rules-based order. One U.S. commentator said when the tariffs were first announced that this would later be regarded as the day the WTO died, the World Trade Organization. Is there something to that argument?
Well, there's another problem that we tend to forget, and that is U.S. policy toward the WTO and the court system, so the dispute settlement system of the WTO. And the U.S. is currently blocking nominations of judges. And that is a major problem, because in any kind of dispute settlement process that we might end up in between the U.S. and the EU, and also Canada, Mexico, and all of the other countries, you don't have a functioning dispute settlement system. So that is the bigger problem, I would say, rather than talking about tariffs on steel or T-shirts and bourbon and so on. We should probably focus our attention to that problem. And there the U.S. is sort of leaning back and saying, yeah, we need reforms. But then there are no proposals for what kind of reforms they're looking for. And that's a problem. So we need to get back to the negotiation table, either at the G7, G20 level or in the WTO membership, and discuss those problems. And it's true that those problems date back further than the Trump presidency. That's a valid argument.
Daryl, Lindsey, is there a potential argument to be made that this could even strengthen the WTO in the sense that China, at least, is suddenly saying very good things about the WTO? And interestingly enough, Cecilia Malmström, the trade commissioner you just mentioned, she has now filed a complaint not only against the U.S. actions, but against China in the WTO for its practices on international intellectual property. So are we seeing perhaps at least some parties reawakening to a sense of how important the WTO actually is?
I think, again, I think that's also another symbolic move, because while the EU has also lodged a complaint against the United States at the WTO and China at the same time, so it sort of shows the United States that by going after China, it shows that we take the core issue with steel and other things, which is actually China, very seriously. And so we're going to have a two-prong approach. We're going to challenge you, but we are also going to challenge China. So, and I think there is also a willingness within the EU to reform the WTO. We just have to get down at the table, and I say we, I'm American, but you know, they just need to get back down at the table and have a serious conversation.
Generally speaking, I want to add, we have to keep a close look on the interests of each country. Certainly, we are claiming free trade in fields where we are very competitive. And in fields where we're not very competitive, we're not claiming free trade. You know, of course, the Chinese want to export their steel and their aluminum, of course, and the Germans want to export their cars, but vice versa, the Europeans, you know, have very high tariffs on agricultural goods, for instance, and so on. So the interest of the WTO is always to strengthen for their own competitive industries. I mean, that's typical.
Let me ask us to take a look at the implications of all of this for Europe as a whole, because some people say this is a watershed moment, not only for the transatlantic relationship and for the WTO, but also for Europe. Nationalism and populism are on the rise here as well, making it harder than ever for the EU to unite on a strong course of action in response to America's tariffs.
Italy's new Prime Minister is Giuseppe Conte. He leads a coalition government that includes an anti-establishment party and a right-wing party. Conte says he's opposed to EU austerity measures to reduce the country's debt. In Spain, Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy was tossed out of office last week after a vote of no confidence. Rajoy's Conservative People's Party has been plagued by corruption scandals for years. In Slovenia, the center-right anti-immigration Slovenian Democratic Party won the most seats in recent parliamentary elections. The SDP focused its campaign on refugee policy. Is the European Union losing its grip?
Daryl, Lindsey, let me pass that question right on to you, coupled with coming back to what you said earlier. You see a potential for divisions, particularly even between France and Germany, if this trade war or trade conflict does heat up. So perhaps you can say something about that as well.
I see two scenarios. One is Trump's overall actions are playing into the hands of the populists in Europe. It could serve to energize them, which would further divide the European Union. And you know, protectionism, which is what Donald Trump is pursuing right now, is something that would also be pursued by the populists in different countries. So it kind of feeds into that. But at the same time, you also see people coming together. So the question is going to be, you know, France and Germany are playing basically one role right now in ratcheting up the pressure on the United States. But which of these will prevail in the end? And that, it's too soon to tell.
Laura Daniels, Donald Trump, as we said, sees himself as a deal maker. In the past couple of weeks, it has sometimes sounded as if Germany's economics minister sees himself the same way. Minister Altmaier has said a couple of things that we might think could serve as a basis later on for pushing the EU to make a deal and perhaps undermine its own commitment to a rule-based order.
Yes, but as far as I know, anything done by the German government as well as the French government in this attempt to negotiate with Trump and his administration was coordinated, and also coordinated with the European Commission. So, I mean,
And do you think it will stay that way going forward?
I truly hope so. I think what needs to be done is that a strong economy like Germany, a powerful chancellor like Merkel needs to she needs to understand the needs of everyone involved, and there won't be a common European position unless we as Germans also listen to the needs of the southern countries, also the Central Eastern European countries. And that's the only way. I mean, to be unified also has costs, and you know, you have to do the internal EU bargain first. I think that's what's happening right now. We see this happening.
Freund, does that internal EU bargain get even harder to make, given the role of the new U.S. ambassador here? He said this week that he sees his role within his new post as empowering right-wing movements. That is a very unusual thing for an ambassador to say. Wouldn't that amount to inciting the divisions we just saw in that report?
Absolutely, and I think he crossed a red line for diplomats. I think that that's not appropriate behavior. You have to understand what foreign policy should accomplish and what it shouldn't accomplish. I mean, it should accomplish to influence we should stay in touch with other countries, and we should also negotiate with other countries on foreign policy. We should never influence domestic politics. I mean, that's a no-go. We always, we know this from the U.S., that the Cubans who live now in Florida trying to put pressure on the U.S. administration always to influence the domestic politics of Cuba. It never worked out, really. You should never try this. And I think Ambassador Granville is should learn his lesson.
And he never should have given the interview to Breitbart, which is viewed by many in Europe as a propaganda channel. It's like the American version of RT.
Let me ask all of you this, because we are slowly coming to the end of our time. We have seen the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, this week giving several interviews in which she continued to take a somewhat ambivalent position in regard to the proposals for European reform that have been put out by French President Macron. And for that reason, she is being criticized by some here in Germany and in Europe as essentially weakening the EU at a moment when it badly needs decisive leadership. So let me ask all of you briefly to answer the question whether Trumpism amounts to a test of Europe's maturity and whether Europe can pass that test. Laura?
Yeah, I think Merkel really needs to think of the long-term consequences of this reluctance to have more European integration. That's a position that's comfortable, it gives you more leverage to be ambivalent, but now is the moment where you actually need to take a decision. And actually the coalition agreement between the CDU and the SPD was pretty clear on where we want to go, where this government is going to go in the European integration direction. So they should follow through on what they already decided and put down in words.
Daryl, Lindsey?
Merkel needs to do far more. She needs to be courageous, or we're going to be headed into a deep crisis in the EU.
Yeah,
Freund?
absolutely. She's also my chancellor. I'm a member also of the Christian Democrats. I think she should try to get the pieces together to talk with one voice, but certainly not on Germany's bill. I mean, Macron is always trying that overall costs should be split up proportionally, like overall Europe, and that means really Germany's got to pay the biggest bill. Merkel should watch out that we are politically united, but economically everybody should has to work at home for themselves.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us here today, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. See you soon.